Alastair Gee is an award-winning editor and reporter at The Guardian, who has also written for The New Yorker Online, The New York Times, and The Economist. Gee lives in New York City. Dani Anguiano writes for The Guardian and was a reporter for the Chico Enterprise-Record. Anguiano lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Alastair, Dani, thank you so much for joining us and congratulations on the book. I'll turn it over to you guys now.
Hi, thank you so much. We're so excited to be here.
Yeah, the Booksmith is one of the absolute best bookstores in San Francisco. So we're so delighted that to be doing this reading, and thank you everyone for attending. We wanted to start by reading a short part of the book. It's just the prologue of the book, and it only takes 7 or 8 minutes, and then we'll get talking. But this is how we'll begin the prologue.
Great, then I will get us started here with the real book in my hands. Okay, let's go. At 8:30 a.m. on November 8th, 2018, John Sedwick pounded on his daughter's bedroom door. "Fire's coming up over the ridge, Sky," he told her, his voice calm but loud, a sign of his increasing deafness. Sky got up quickly. Sedwick was not an alarmist. He knew fire, and if he considered it serious, it was. As part of a career that included periods as a museum docent, a logger for the Forest Service, an orderly at a state hospital, Sedwick had spent years as a volunteer firefighter on the Paradise Ridge, a forested perch in the foothills of California's Sierra Nevada mountain range. He'd been living here in the community of Magalia, just north of Paradise, off and on since he had first visited as a child. More than 70 years later, Sedwick still resided in the same home, a century-old 2-bedroom cabin with orange walls and a bathtub on the back porch. Sky, who had recently turned 50, had moved in with him a couple years ago when she was recovering from various health problems. As smoke lingered in the air, Sky, fresh out of the shower, hurriedly gathered the things she'd need: clothes, shoes, and the makeup bag that she never left home without. The Sedwick's rambling property was dotted with John's vintage vehicles, including an ancient flatbed truck and a faded red 1940s-era bulldozer. Its environs were magnificent. The inhabitants of the town of Paradise and the smaller communities that surrounded it spent their days among a gorgeous profusion of pines and oaks and wildflowers. More and more, it was becoming a refuge for people priced out of the rest of the state, where the cost of living had risen to untenable levels. Occasional wildfires broke out near the ridge, but Sedwick, and nearly anyone who'd ever paid much attention, knew that the area could face a real fire, a bad one. People prepared for the worst, but they didn't always comprehend how awful the worst could be. When the fire risk was high, Sedwick always made the same plea as he and his daughter sat down for meals. "Please, Jesus, no fires today." After packing, Sky walked outside to where her father stood in the yard. "Dad, is there something I should do? Should I wet the ground?" Sedwick shook his head. When she returned with her bags, Sedwick told her that he would stay, for now. Sky, an auburn-haired artist who used to work as a counselor in a juvenile detention center, was planning to meet her boyfriend at a gas station a mile or so down the road. She took a few steps and paused. Still holding her bags and her dog, Sky hugged her trim, compact father goodbye. He grunted when she said, "I love you," but she knew that that meant "I love you too."
The road that curved past their home was already blocked and nearly at a standstill with cars trying to evacuate. "Don't go that way," Sedwick had warned Sky. She set off down a quiet lane leading away from their house, shaded by ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, until she was just far enough from the cabin that Sedwick wouldn't have heard her if she yelled. She could see flames catching in the undergrowth, and thought about turning back to tell him how bad things were, but decided against it. He knows, she thought to herself. Sedwick was stubborn. There was no getting him to change tack once he had made a decision. Dad will leave if it gets bad. She moved even more quickly, through the smoke and up onto an embankment that she used where the road became impassable. Ethereal bits of glowing dust fell from the sky. Sky watched them uneasily. Embers, she thought. It was approximately 9:30 a.m. A few hours earlier, satellites had captured flames approaching Paradise at about 21 miles per hour, faster than the previously posited maximum for wildfire spread. They were consuming almost 400 American football fields worth of vegetation a minute. Smoke blotted out the sun and streamed low over the town, reducing the visible world to paradise and nothing more. The flames, when they arrived, were unstoppable, far beyond the capacity of any firefighter to control. In places, they burned as hot as a crematorium. Cars turned into rivulets of molten metal. Homes became matches that set fire to the next. The conditions gave rise to apparitions only seen in the most extreme of blazes, fire tornadoes. Within hours, the fire would consume Paradise, trapping thousands of people who were trying to flee on roads designed for a fraction of that number. Emergency responders would mount a heroic defense and rescue operation that included at its peak 5,500 firefighters and 600 engines. But when the blaze was finally brought under control with the help of rain 17 days later, it had become the deadliest wildfire in America in a century, and the deadliest ever in recorded California history. The town of Paradise would suffer a fate almost without parallel in the modern era in the United States. Total devastation. That's the prologue from the book. And I think before we start talking and taking questions, we wanted to tell you a little bit about how we came to this book and this story in the first place.
Great. So this is a story that really means a lot to both of us. We've been reporting on the fire since it began in November 2018. I actually grew up near Paradise and had family and friends who lived there, and I used to work as a reporter in the area. And in November 2018, I was working for The Guardian when I saw reports of this fire that had started in Paradise, and I started getting calls and texts from friends and family telling me how worried they were, asking me to pray for their town. And when that happened, when I started reading up on the fire and seeing how bad it would be, I asked my editors at The Guardian to send me to cover it. So I was there right away, walking through the ruins of Paradise, talking to some of the tens of thousands of people who'd been displaced, and seeing all the various ways that the fire impacted that town and the rest of the state. And during that time, Alastair, was editing some of my earliest stories, and then we started working together to tell the story of what happened in Paradise.
And by the way, as we're talking, please feel free to type in questions, send us in what you want to know, and we'd love to turn to it. But as Dani mentioned, I started working on this story a week or two after the fire and went up to Paradise and the Chico area. And as Dani mentioned, the scene that met us there was really apocalyptic. It was so astonishing to be in this town, a town of almost 30,000 people, and over 90% of the buildings were destroyed. And so you drove into town and a lot of the trees were actually still standing, but the homes were gone. 14,000 homes were destroyed and over 90% of the buildings in town were gone. And so not only was there absolutely nothing left of the town, or virtually nothing left, but all of the people who had lived in the town, the 30,000 or so people from Paradise, maybe another 15,000 from the communities around the town, they had been displaced and were camping at the Walmart, and they were filling every hotel and motel around town. So that was the scene that confronted us. And so we basically spent, in the course of reporting our early stories and reporting on the book, we would spend, one of us would be there probably every weekend or 3-day weekends. We were doing Freedom of Information Act requests to try and get records on CAL FIRE and PG&E, and we were speaking to, I think in total, hundreds and hundreds of people, residents, wildfire scientists, experts on PG&E, first responders. We were doing that fun stereotype of research and going to the library and looking at microfiche copies of the Paradise Post from decades past, really trying to both tell the story of the disaster and also tell the story of this town and this region. And I think Dani maybe could say more about what made this place so special, because she knows it so well.
Right. Paradise was a really special community. People who live there always say that when they would tell people where they'd live, people asked, is it really paradise? And I think for a lot of people it was. It was this small community nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills, about a 15-minute drive from the valley. And even the drive up was magical. You would drive up into Paradise and see these sweeping views of rice fields and the tiny Sutter Butte mountain range. And then after about 15 or so minutes, you were just immersed in the trees, tens of thousands of trees all over the place, and this small, close-knit town of 30,000 people that was friendly and also really affordable, much more affordable than the rest of the state. And people who came to Paradise generally really loved it.
Yeah, I think that affordability and that it was so part of the way of life there. A young family could afford to buy a home. It was cheap. I mean, that also contributed. That was also part of the reason why there were a higher percentage of people with disabilities than in the rest of the state. There were also quite a lot of retirees, and those factors contributed also to the difficulty of the evacuation and the rescue. And we're getting some questions in, but maybe we can just sketch out for you all just maybe what happened in the first hours of the fire and the day of the fire and the general timescale, and then we can turn to the questions.
Yeah, so the morning of November 8th, 2018, a power line broke about 5 or 10 miles away from Paradise, and it sparked this fire that, driven by the wind, quickly just sort of grew out of control. And it was in a relatively inaccessible area where firefighters just couldn't get to it. And what happened was within about an hour and a half, it made this rapid march toward Paradise, moving more quickly than fire scientists knew that fire could actually move. And by 8 a.m. that morning, it had descended upon the town of Paradise, and the people most familiar with fire, the firefighters, the police, the 911 dispatchers, it defied belief even for them that it was already there. And once it arrived, it swept over the entire town. Wind, drove embers far ahead of the main body of the blaze and just set these spot fires all over town. And so by the time people knew there was a fire, they had to leave. And from there, they were all piling onto the roads. And in a town of 27,000, in any town of any size for that matter, if everyone piles onto the roads at the same time, you have massive gridlock. And so all these people were trying to flee to safety, and they got on these roads that were quickly being overrun by fire. So you had the entire town trying to make an escape, and all around them things were burning.
And I think that very quickly, within the first hours, became a refugee crisis of the kind that I mentioned. And by that evening, I remember reading one of the early quotes that came out, and it was from a firefighter spokesperson, and he said, "The town of Paradise is gone. It's just gone." And so the fire continued to burn for about 2 more weeks. It was only put out pretty much by Thanksgiving, partly by the rain. The town remained cordoned off for several more weeks, and well, maybe about a month, 3 to 4 weeks in total. And during that time, there was a massive search and recovery operation taking place within the town. So it was completely cordoned off. People weren't allowed to enter. DNA forensic teams pioneered some methods that hadn't been tried in the field before to try and identify these remains, because they were in such an advanced state of, to be honest, destruction. The fire had burned as hot as a crematorium in places. And eventually people started to come back, but it wasn't to a town that they recognized, and there wasn't much to come back to. And so from then until today, it's been a very, very slow process of trying to rebuild and trying to understand who was to blame, what really happened, and how can we prevent this again. All of which are questions we're happy to talk about, as well as some of the incredible human stories. I mean, I think that was what really stood out to us in the reporting, was the people we met and their stories, and which we tried to thread through the book and make the backbone of the book. And John Sedwick and Skye Sedwick are two of the people whose stories meant a great deal to us, and so that's why you hear them in the prologue. So we're also happy to just tell you some stories about the people and what they were like, and you know, the sad things, but also the amazing things we heard. So Dani, we're getting some questions. Do you want to take it away?
Yes, so our first question is about the people who stayed behind after the fire, like the guy in the later chapter who begins collecting dogs. How were they surviving day to day? So quite a few people actually stayed behind if they could. And then what happened is because the town was cordoned off, they were just stuck in town. And for one man in particular, that proved to be particularly challenging because he was there with many, many animals. And I think Alastair is probably best equipped to answer that question.
Yeah, this is a gentleman called Jeff Evans, who is the picture of the gold rush. Paradise is a gold rush town. It was founded in the 1800s, and Jeff Evans looked like he stepped right out of the gold rush. He's got a thick, bushy mustache. He wears a checked shirt tucked into his jeans, and he speaks in this very, very dignified, polite way, which has something very Victorian or 19th century about it. But he found himself behind this cordon. He and his elderly parents, his dad was a World War II vet, were able to defend their home from the fire. But afterwards, they found themselves trapped behind this cordon, and they feared that if they left the cordon to go and get supplies, for instance, they feared that they wouldn't be allowed back in. And all of their neighbors, some of whose homes burned, some of whose homes survived, a lot of them had been trapped outside. And so what he discovered was, just wandering around the area doing reconnaissance, was he kept encountering animals, both domestic and farmyard animals, that people had either abandoned or simply weren't able to take with them. I mean, what was most remarkable was that he came upon this collection of 7 or 8 cars that had been abandoned at a lake crossing, and he had no idea what happened to the occupants of these vehicles, which had survived the fire, but were just stood there higgledy-piggledy, sort of next to each other on the crossing. But he went and looked in these cars, and he found a bunch of dogs. In fact, in total, he took home, after discovering those dogs and others, maybe about a dozen dogs. And he ended up living with those dogs for about a month until the town reopened. And he also ended up taking care of mules, of ducks, of pigs that he found. I mean, he basically had a bit of a menagerie going on at his house. And I loved what he told me about them. He said, you know, like, these dogs, they tore up our house. They were puppies that weren't house trained. They were, they were chewing the carpet. They were doing their business everywhere inside. But he said that having these dogs, this had to be one of the most therapeutic things we could have possibly done to get through the tragedy and the trauma of this all. And in fact, one of the dogs, Bella, that he rescued, the owner came back to him afterwards and said, I don't think that I can provide as good a home for Bella as you can, so I would like you to keep Bella. And so Bella is a dog that Jeff still has, and that he told me that Bella every night checks on his elderly parents and then comes and sleeps next to him. And I actually went to Jeff's house, and it is true what he said. Those dogs did a number on his house. There is still no carpet. It's undergoing a massive renovation, but Jeff and his parents are very sprightly and wonderful people. So yeah. The next question, Elizabeth asks, your research was so comprehensive, so many interviews cited in the footnotes. I wonder if you reached out to PG&E and if they were willing to talk with you. And if not, were you surprised that they weren't willing to talk to you? Dani, do you want to?
Sure. I think PG&E was our great headache of last spring. They were not responsive to our numerous requests to try to reach out to them. And that meant we had to put the story together other ways, through these public records requests and looking at both documents that were publicly available from PG&E and from regulators. But what we did find is we were able to actually talk to the workers and to get the perspective of the people on the ground, which is great, because there's generally they generally say more interesting things than spokespeople do in any case. So one of the PG&E workers that we spoke with was actually this PG&E lineman who lived in Paradise and lost his house in the fire. And he got to tell us about what kind of work they're expected to do, and sort of his thinking on the fire and what the company could or could have not have done differently. And his perspective was an interesting one. It was that with the climate changing and with the weather conditions the way they were, that there wasn't any way PG&E could have prevented that fire. Not everyone agrees with that, but that was his perspective.
One person we spoke to, he was formerly he was part of the regulator, the PG&E's regulators, the CPUC. And he had this really fascinating quote. He said that there's this theory of organizations, that some organizations can get so complicated that no one person could fully grasp how they operate. And he said, I put PG&E in that category. And they have, it's true, they have over 100,000 miles of power lines. They have thousands of miles of gas lines. It was fascinating for us just to trace the history back of PG&E back to the gold rush, and to see how the story of PG&E fit into the story of California. And, I guess these are the delights of research, but I think just for us, seeing how companies like PG&E came to be so influential in California, owing, for instance, in California's case, to the lack, and it sounds so esoteric to say this, but California didn't have any coal reserves in the 19th century, which is how so much of the eastern US powered itself. And so California became a culture that was powered by hydroelectricity. Power basically came from the Sierra Nevada, from watercourses there, and was sent over to the cities on the coast with miles and miles of power line. And so that was the birth of companies like PG&E. Is essentially they came out of this weird historical quirk of the way energy works in California, and PG&E's this electricity from the Sierra Nevada. It was institutional, for instance, in the rebuilding of California, San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake. So PG&E has really been instrumental in, has played a deep role in California's history, and so it's striking what the situation we've ended up with today.
We are getting some really great questions coming in. One of them, do you see the upcoming wildfire season and the coronavirus pandemic converging or affecting each other in any way? And yes, they actually already are. I know a lot of fire departments have had to delay trainings. Authorities have stop doing controlled burns because of, the issues around smoke and not wanting to irritate anyone's lungs during a pandemic. And I know there are a lot of concerns going forward into this fire season about how do you socially distance and prevent the spread of coronavirus among firefighters working in really close quarters. And I think we're all kind of waiting to see how that will play out.
One of the things we had course, to think about in recent weeks as well is, are there echoes in any way of coronavirus and wildfires? You know, are there any sort of deeper theoretical links or ideas that link them? And I think what we hit on is this idea of how, you know, with both wildfires and coronavirus, there is, in some sense, this shared etiology, and that is to do with the way humans are changing the natural environment, and we are releasing forces that prove to be deadly for us. You know, with the case of coronavirus, we are trafficking wild animals, some of which carry viruses that may end up being transferred to humans. We're deforesting areas that are home to species that, again, may dislodge viruses. We're bringing those species into markets where they can then interact with livestock or with humans again. And also with wildfires, you know, there is this the broader story of why wildfires are getting so bad in the Western US. One part of it is anthropogenic climate change, and another part of it is to do with the way we've historically managed forests. You know, California's forests were built to burn, and when a forest has a wildfire, it clears away a lot of the density and the undergrowth that then ensures that future wildfires aren't as severe. But we've gotten so good at suppressing wildfires in California in the last 100 years that actually a lot of the forests are unnaturally dense, which makes wildfires worse. And so in both spheres, in coronavirus and wildfires, there is this shared human thread to do with the way that we are changing the natural world, and it's not always, you know, it sometimes has disastrous consequences. So the next question is from Hillary, and she asks, what was the role of local newspapers, the Paradise Post and the Chico Enterprise-Record? Any words of wisdom about how they might survive in the COVID-19 era? So as an alumna of the Chico ER, I'll let Dani take that one.
Yes, I love this question, not only because I get to brag about my friends, but because I get to sing the praises of local journalism. The Chico Enterprise-Record and the Paradise Post were just instrumental to coverage of the Camp Fire. This was one of those events where outlets from around the country and around the world dropped in, but I just think no one can cover an event quite like the local paper. And, you know, they were responsible for providing information to the people who lived there, you know, about what was going to affect them next and how their lives were going to be impacted. They did an incredible job. They were, I believe, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and they do great work like that all the time. The COVID-19 era is having a devastating effect on journalism, especially on local news organizations that have already been struggling over the last few decades. How to survive is a question I wish I knew the answer to. I think it solved problems for a lot of people, but the one thing we can all do is support local journalism and subscribe to our local newspapers.
We actually met the editor of the Paradise Post at this really funny, quirky Paradise tradition. It's called Gold Nugget Days, and we went to it last spring, and it's an event that commemorates the anniversary of the discovery of the Dogtown Nugget. And the Dogtown Nugget is actually, we learned, it was one of the biggest ever pure gold nuggets found during the gold rush, and it was found basically a couple miles from Paradise. And so Gold Rush Days is like a Gold Rush era celebration, a Gold Rush themed celebration of that discovery. And we met the editor of the Paradise Post at that event. He's a guy named Rick Silver. And what's amazing is that paper, despite what was going on, it published without pause through the disaster, and is still, you know, as far as we can tell, as far as I can tell from the outside anyway, you know, going strong and doing an amazing job covering the recovery of Paradise.
They actually delivered copies of the paper to the local evacuation centers since there was no one to deliver it to in the town of Paradise.
A question from Justine. She says, how did you two tag team this process?
Well, that was a fun one. Alastair and I worked together very well, I think. We kind of approached it in some ways as if we were writing the book alone. We just sort of, went to Paradise and tried to talk to as many people as we could, separately, sometimes together. And then, we would come together and tell each other the stories that we'd heard. And that was kind of how we figured out how to shape the book, the stories that made us, that moved both of us. Whether it was the story of John and Skye Sedwick, and John, the 82-year-old, deciding to stay and fight the fire himself, or that of this lovely couple, Iris and Andrew, who, moved to Paradise to collect antiques, and ended up separated that day.
Yeah, I actually remember a lot of those phone calls where, you would do an interview that would deeply move you, and Dani was just the first person I wanted to decompress with about it and talk to about it and process it with, and I would call immediately afterwards from the car. But yeah, we did. I mean, I spent a lot of time in very random motels, very far away from Paradise, actually, because at the time we were reporting it, Paradise was still, it was still a refugee crisis. And so the hotels and motels from dozens of miles around were completely booked out. And I didn't want to I was concerned anyway about taking a hotel room from an evacuee. So I would stay, dozens and dozens of miles away from the fire. And Dani and I would be there on probably on alternate weekends. But there was one time that I remember that we were there together that really touched me, and we had driven out to a nearby town to see this former fire chief called Chris Hale, who told us some amazing stories about his time defending the Paradise Ridge. But Dani, in the car, as we were passing by this little mountain range, I think it's like California's smallest mountain range or something, it's called the Sutter Buttes, and it's in the middle of the Central Valley, surrounded by rice fields, and it's like these little peaks that suddenly emerge out of the valley. And Dani said to me, it's places like Paradise I feel most at home in the world, and I wrote it down in my notebook. I was so touched by that. But so yeah, it was in sum a really great experience working with Dani.
Yes, we get along very well. No secrets to be revealed there. Some more questions coming in. How is Paradise being rebuilt? Are they designing to prevent this from happening again in the future? So Paradise is slowly coming back together. I think people who were from there have kind of accepted it's going to be a very different place, probably a smaller place, because as of right now, it's at about 15% of its pre-fire population. So many homes were destroyed, 90% of the homes in the town, 14,000 in total, that there just weren't much left. So the people who are there are those whose homes just happen to survive. And sometimes it's just like a single home on a street that's otherwise completely destroyed. Or people who have slowly started to rebuild, or, have had homes delivered to the area. And it's coming together slowly but surely. I think because some of the homes are newer, that they're already up to code in a way that the homes that previously existed weren't. They were much older, which in some cases made them much more flammable. So that's certainly one of the elements of the conversation is, how do we build in a way that we can survive this if it ever happens again? And there are many, many different ideas about that, many things still being discussed.
I think one of the most striking moments for me when I was interviewing, I met up with a couple of times with Joe Kennedy, who is a firefighter who did these amazing things. I mean, on the day of the fire, while the whole town of 30,000 people was on the roads trying to get out, he was one of the first responders trying to go the other way and ride towards danger, as they put it, as firefighters put it. And he unloaded his bulldozer and proceeded to save many, many lives. And I met him in person, and he is this enormous gentleman. He's maybe 6'4", built like a tank, and has a very stoic external appearance. But actually, as he told me, he loves to let his daughter paint his fingernails and braid his hair. So he has a lovely heart underneath that very tough exterior. But he lives in Grass Valley, which, as I'm sure people know, is not that far from Paradise. It's about 100 miles southeast, also in the foothills of the Sierra. And I remember going to meet him at his firehouse, where he dispatched from on the day of the fire, and he showed me his bulldozer, which had been completely repainted after almost melting essentially in the fire, and it was gleaming in yellow. And the fire station, it was before fire season, so the fire station was completely silent. It was just standing in the forest. It felt very museum-like, almost very, very peaceful. And we sat in an office near these gleaming fire trucks, and he told me that he thought that what Paradise had shown him was that he could be next, essentially, that towns like Grass Valley could very, very easily be next. It didn't take much of a leap of imagination to recognize that Paradise was terrible, but actually, in terms of its situation, a community in the hills, in this region that has evolved to have fire, that has seen deadlier fires thanks to climate change, it was no stretch of the imagination to imagine that that kind of fire could hit Grass Valley, Nevada City, anywhere like that. And the way I don't know, the way he told me that, I was so struck by it. I wasn't expecting to hear. What I heard again and again was people like that sort of saying, actually, what this fire has shown us is how vulnerable we all are to this kind of thing. And another fire scientist, she lives in Berkeley, actually, her name is Faith Kearns. What she told me was, she lives in the flatlands in Berkeley. But what she said was, after fires like Paradise, after the fire tornado in Redding, after the Oakland Hills fire, I think that I can see a situation where a fire makes it down to me in the flatlands, or tears through, I don't know, the hills in Los Angeles and makes it into a major urban area, same in San Diego, perhaps. And so I think for me, that's what came through, is how much of a clarion call or an eye-opener that the campfire was in Paradise.
Yeah, I think that addresses another question that we got about institutional changes and city planning. I think one of the striking things that Alastair and I found was that Paradise was actually much better prepared, than most cities when it comes to dealing with a fire like this. They had an evacuation plan. They had staged a drill. They had a reverse 911 system that would alert residents who had signed up for warnings that there was a fire. So they were much better prepared than I think people realized initially. And things, still obviously went very badly. So I think seeing the worst, cities all across California are, reevaluating how they prepare for disasters, because we know that the worst can happen.
And again, some people have asked about specific design changes and other kinds of changes. So in California, there's a baseline of building code that basically specifies that new buildings in fire-prone areas, they have to be built with certain design considerations. So that is, for instance, they have to have all kinds of openings into the home blocked up, because often one of the major ways that a building in a wildfire catches on fire is not when the fire is moving through, it's embers that float through, maybe even after the main fire front has gone through already. It's embers that just come in and enter the house that way. And there are regulations around not having gutters, for instance, where leaf litter could gather. And so those are some of the baseline changes that homes built in dangerous areas have to abide by. But speaking to, for instance, experts on traffic, Dani mentioned earlier that no city in the US could evacuate all of its residents at once. This expert described it to us as like being after a sports game. If you have everyone pouring out after a ball game, unavoidably, you're going to have massive traffic and massive gridlock. It's not a fault of necessarily the road system or the way the city is designed. You just pour that many people onto the road at one time and you're going to have a problem. And so there is this idea now around maybe we need to have more shelter in place setups. And Paradise actually did have two locations designated for sheltering in place, these basically stretches of asphalt where people could wait out a fire on a surface that was non-flammable. But as that happens in the campfire, it turned out that many people couldn't get to these, and firefighters actually created impromptu shelters in place by corralling people into intersections and defending them with water cannons like they were, I don't know, military soldiers defending a position from attack. And so the idea is maybe we need to essentially have more sheltering in place. And we could talk more about the thinking that's going on with emergency alert systems and all that kind of thing, but those are the broad strokes of what's happening.
To expand on what Alastair was saying about homes setting fire to the next, and about people having to shelter in place in town. One man we talked to, Andrew Duran, who grew up in Paradise, but lives most of the year now in Nebraska, and he works as a carpenter. He woke up that morning in his mother's house in Paradise, and she told him about the fire and that it was, the city was evacuating. And she was going to leave, but Andrew decided then and there that he was going to stay and try to fight this fire himself. He had some firefighting experience in his youth, and he just thought to himself, I can't let my mom go homeless. I won't let her house burn down. So he tried to stay, and he, started clearing brush. He got out a hose and was wetting down the roof, but eventually the fire started moving toward him. He could hear it eating through the brush. And then all of a sudden it was at the house on the other side of the fence, and then it was at the fence, and then it was at the tree, and from there it was in his mother's house, and the hose he was holding ran out of water, and so he was in a really tough spot, and he realized all he could do was go and stand on the asphalt road and hope that the fire would burn around him.
As a question from Ash, do you think this fire changed people's perspectives on climate change, especially those who didn't think that climate change is real? It's a really interesting question. Firstly, I think back to that terrible fire tornado that happened in Reading earlier in the summer of 2018, actually, several months before the Camp Fire. And I remember for a Guardian story, one of our reporters spoke to the local congressman. There's a guy named Doug LaMalfa, and he had famously spoken out against the existence of climate change. He denied that it existed, and so our reporter asked him, "Look, your constituency has just been ravaged by a fire tornado. Do you think climate change is playing a role?" And he said, "Who knows? The planet could be cooling. There could be oscillations of the sun. Who knows if it's climate change? All I know is we're gonna, sort this out." And commendably, he wanted to sort it out. But even in that kind of extreme situation, he wasn't willing to go there with climate change. And I would say that it's a mixed bag, right? Like I remember speaking to a firefighter who had this incredible story in Paradise of seeing the fire come and spending all night, not just the day of the fire, which arrived at 8 a.m., but all that day, and then all the following night defending his home successfully. Finally, the morning after, he sent me this amazing photo of him and a fire crew in his living room, exhausted, sat there after defending his home in his street for 24 hours straight. And he still said to me after this, "Yep, climate change, no, it's no such thing. It's cyclical. We always see fires." And so, there were definitely holdouts, but I would say that in large part, I would say that the majority of people that I spoke to accepted that the climate was changing. I think the distinction that came through is, even though the majority of people did accept it, what the breakdown seemed to be was whether or not they accepted that it was anthropogenic, whether or not it was human caused. And so a lot of people said to me, maybe, and there were more conservative people, that said, "Look, yes, we agree that the climate is changing. I don't think that humans have anything to do with it, that humans could influence something as big as climate, but I accept that it's changing and California is getting hotter and drier." So I suppose that's progress. That's a good thing. I don't know what you found, Dani.
Yeah, I found it to be very similar. I think, from my experience, and I certainly didn't talk to all 27,000 people who'd lived in that area before, but what I found is generally people who already were concerned about the climate crisis, that those people, even more so afterward, thought that thought that obviously this was caused by climate change. However, there are plenty of people who don't. I think what people agree on is that something is different, that these fires are different than the fires we used to see. Essentially, every firefighter I talked to said that this was what they're seeing today is not what they were seeing 30 years ago. I think part of it is this, there were so many factors that go into it. I think the climate crisis set the stage for the fire, but as we know, it was a PG&E power line that ultimately failed and started it. PG&E has said that that's going to keep happening in the climate crisis. And then, I think Trump brought up forest management. So there's all these different factors that for various people, that's the main thing. It's the climate crisis, it's forest management, it's PG&E.
Didn't he say raking the forest floors?
Raking, yeah, exactly.
Trump in a press conference immediately after the fire, he flew into the area on Air Force One, and Dani was there to greet Air Force One, and he toured Paradise, and he did two sort of slightly ridiculous things. Well, I don't want to say ridiculous because there was an element of truth. What he said about raking forest floors. He said that in Finland he had heard, don't they rake forest floors with rakes, and doesn't that prevent forest fires? And it does sound a bit a little bit eccentric to say that, but there is an element of truth. I mentioned earlier that forests are, because we've gotten so good at fire suppression, forests are unnaturally dense by historical standards. It was said that in 150 years ago in John Muir's time, you could maybe ride a wagon or a horse through a Sierra Nevada forest and not get smacked on either side by branches. And now that's no longer the case in many places. And so there is an element of truth in what the president was saying. The other thing that he did say that wasn't great was he referred on Paradise on two occasions as pleasure, the town of pleasure. And Jerry Brown and various people in the audience had to correct him and shout out from the audience, "It's Paradise." We have a question on what were some of our favorite stories that we heard. Who did you enjoy meeting the most, and what stories do you enjoy hearing? Dani, do you wanna?
Yeah, I think for me, there's so many. The ones that I think, always stick out to me are that of John and Skye Sedwick, who we read about in the prologue. But to just tell you a little bit more about their story, John Sedwick, was this 82-year-old former volunteer firefighter. And the morning of the fire, he decided he was going to stay. And what you didn't hear in the prologue was that he stayed and helped local firefighters and out-of-town firefighters because he knew that area so well that he was able to drive around and try to get a sense of where it was, that he helped his neighbors save their homes, and that he helped save this old historic firehouse, that was over 100 years old that he had once worked in. So he cherished that town so much, and he spent that day doing as much as he could to save it. And I think part of the reason that story sticks with me is because, to me, it's so representative of the spirit of this area, of people who love and cherish where they live, and will do anything they can to protect and preserve it.
One of the questions that I found one of the interviews that I found most delightful, I spoke to a woman named Linda Lau, and the reason I found her, it was a really complicated story, but she wrote a cookbook and basically in the introduction to the cookbook, which is nothing to do with Paradise, she mentions that she was brought up in the town of Paradise, and that her father in fact owned the first Chinese restaurant in Paradise. And I got Linda on the phone, and she told me more about it, that her father did indeed go to Paradise shortly after the Second World War, opened the Pagoda, which is the first Chinese restaurant in Paradise. She said that there'd been some opposition from the Chamber of Commerce, but that eventually the restaurant had opened. And she was trying to give me a sense of what the town was like then. And I asked her, well, the town, as I understand it then as now, was mostly white. What was that like? And she said, well, there were definitely challenges, but one of the most remarkable things is that although in high school I was one of only two ethnically Chinese American students, the other one being my brother, when it came time to elect the homecoming king and queen in 1964, I was elected homecoming queen. And she said, I have no idea what happened. I was facing off against two cheerleaders. I'm baffled then. I was delighted and baffled, and I'm still baffled. But for me, that just said something about Paradise, is that like every place, right, there's strife of all kinds, and I wouldn't want to diminish that. But also, like in pretty much any place as well, you can get delightful examples of people, maybe, I don't know, seeing past differences and just recognizing something human and special in their fellows. And so that was what that story meant to me. And so okay, we have two last questions. One is, I can't wait to read more. How can we get autographs on our books? And so to that question, I think maybe we can send people book plates with our autographs, Dani? I don't know.
I like that idea.
Okay, and the very last question is, have you heard any reaction from residents you interviewed who have read the book?
Yes, we've gotten some really lovely reactions. We've gotten some very nice reviews, but I think what's touched our hearts the most is just the wonderful feedback we've gotten from the people in the book, people like Sky Sedwick. And some of the things they've said that have really touched me are about, Sky told me how, the spirit of her father really shines through in this book. John Sedwick was actually working on this book for years and years. He was writing a fiction book and he never got to finish it. And so Sky said she feels like that, through this in some way, his book made it out there. And one of the other nice things that someone had to say was just how they felt like, perhaps it had allowed them to start to find closure. One man told me that the house he grew up in was gone, his aunt's house was gone, his stepdad's house was gone, all these homes he knew were gone, and that his daughter had told him it was time to move on. And then, he had read our book and he said he thought that maybe he was ready to start to try to do that.
I was thinking about what does one get from writing a book? It's something I have always aspired to since I was a kid, is to write a book. And I was just thinking, after our book came out, Dani and I had lots of conversations around that. What should you expect from putting a book out? What should you feel? What does it mean? And in conversations, I realized that there were a couple of things that I genuinely took a pleasure, gratification, a sense of having accomplished something from. And one of those things was locals. It's having locals come up to us and say that they recognize their town, they recognize themselves in the book, that we captured something that was real. And I decided that for me was one of the things that would make me feel most satisfied with the work. And we've had that kind of feedback. I think, I've heard from a couple of the people we've mentioned. I've heard from the gentleman who saved all of the domestic animals afterwards, and he's told me he loved it. We heard from the mayor of Paradise, who emailed to say that she'd learned things about the town that she hadn't known before, and about the fire. So for me, those are the most satisfying and rewarding kinds of feedback when people say that we captured something about a place they know and they love. I think we're at the end. Evan, should we just sign off? How do we do this?
I'll pop back up to just thank you guys. It's been wonderful, and congratulations on the book. Wish you guys both so much good fortune with it, and it's been a pleasure to have you here with us tonight.